Okay, we will get started. Welcome everybody to roundtable number 2, hosted by SkillSource Learning Partners. Today's roundtable is around leading and engaging neurodivergent learners. Little agenda, just to show you what we're going to cover today. So engaging different neurological profiles is essential for creating an inclusive and productive learning environment. We've invited industry experts to discuss neurodiversity, including techniques, accommodations, and ideas to create a workplace that adapts to all employees. So we're going to introduce our speakers, Catherine Kerrigan and Jessica Michaels. I'm going to have Catherine start off to introduce herself. We'll go to Jessica to introduce herself, and then to start off the program, Catherine will start speaking.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Eric, and wonderful to be here. Appreciate you all for being here. So I have been in technology for about 20 years. And with that, there's been, I've worked with a handful of different groups, communities, how brains think, and started one of the first .com businesses in the early 2000s, moved into executive management, and then went back to entrepreneurship within the AI and ML space. And really, neurodiversity is super close to my heart. A lot of my friends have children. I've been impacted by people that I know, myself as well, to really bring education and awareness about what neurodiversity is to the forefront, and especially in the workplace. So with that, I will let Eric introduce Jessica.
Thank you, Catherine. And then on to Jessica.
Hello, I'm Jessica Michaels. I am a L&D aficionado. I've been a management development specialist and instructional designer and facilitator for about 25 years. And I am thrilled to be here. The only thing I'm more passionate about than L&D is neurodiversity, being autistic and ADHD myself. And I'm so excited to talk about how we can help our learners help each other and really work in an environment where they can be supported by the work that we provide in L&D.
Wonderful. All right, we are going to move on. Here we go. I think this is where Catherine will start off.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Jessica. So what we've identified is through our core research, which has definitely been supported by the Harvard Business Review, 33% of the US population identifies as neurodivergent. What does neurodivergent mean? And Jessica will get into this in a few slides, but it could be anything from just how your brain thinks differently, right? So, and oftentimes they're classified in psychological things like ADD, ADHD, OCD, autism, Asperger's, which was a common term back in the day. But looking at all of that and looking at that population and saying, wow, 33% of all of us really were affected, right, in some way. And maybe it's situational, maybe it's, temporary, or maybe it's permanent. Doesn't really matter. But like, how do we all coexist in the workspace? So Eric, I think you can move on to the next slide. So this is a great stat, right? And this really brings to light the impact and the breadth and depth of the neurodivergent community. So currently 7.4 million adults in the United States, which also kind of correlates to that 33%, they classify as neurodivergent. And it's not a bad thing, right? It could be a little bit of anxiety or dyslexia or just something that is a little bit different. So, yep. Cool. And going back to the Harvard Business Review, so what's great about this community, and I used neurodivergent. I classify them as a community because we truly are. We think differently, we act differently, but what's great is that they are 30% more productive. But what's also wonderful, and we can get into this through natural conversation on this roundtable, is that they're oftentimes more creative. They think differently. So, we've all been in a business situation where someone says, "Oh, we have this business operations procedure because that's how it's always been." And it's usually, and Jessica will take the lead here soon, but like it's usually that creative community that changes things, that pushes the needle, that makes you think differently, that presents ideas in a different way, that which usually ends up in beautiful business transactions, revenue, proper, management, and just also at the end of the day, a healthy workplace. Yeah. So this is a good lead in. So as of August 1st, there's been about 9.6 million job openings. So you look at that, and that can span everything from working at a fast food restaurant to executive job openings, right? So that number is pretty dramatic. And then, and I'll let Eric kind of move on to the next slide to help us. Yep. So this is kind of, it really, it is very poignant, right? So if you look at neurodivergence, whether you have, and I'll let Jessica has a beautiful slide that she'll show, ADD, OCD, dyslexia, all of that. Within that population of neurodiversity, 80% are either unemployed or underemployed, right? So if you think back and you say, okay, well, we have 9.6 million job openings. How beautiful would it be to properly marry up a, a person that's neurodiverse and a job opening? And it's kind of a perfect setting for us to better understand how to work with each other, how to work with different brain types, and go from there. Cool. And I think I'll let Jessica take it from here.
Yes, absolutely. So let's talk about what these numbers mean in real life, because statistics are great, but that's not what we experience when we go to work every day, for most of us anyway. So if you could go to 12, Eric, please. So we've talked about some of the different medical conditions or identities that are involved in neurodiversity. And it's important to know that neurodiversity itself, that's not a medical diagnosis. That's a sociological term that we use to describe a group of people whose brains have these differences. Some called out on the slide. Katie mentioned a few earlier. But you don't diagnose somebody with neurodiversity, and that can be something that is a little confusing for people. So if you go to the next slide, one of the things that all of these differences have in common is that they all affect the brain's processing of information. And I think, when we think about what that means, how your brain processes information means everything from how you feel emotions, like how you feel mad, if you know you feel mad, if you know you feel hungry, how you pay attention, how you sense the world around you through physical touch. It can also be how you recognize when it's your turn to talk in a conversation, or how you get up and do things. So really, when we talk about brain differences, it really is a different way of experiencing the world in just about every sense. And we know that that's a big thing to try to latch onto if you have not experienced it yourself. So we've got a little thought exercise that might be able to help. So if you go to the next slide. So think of computers or think of cell phones. So computers all pretty much look the same, laptops and desktops, cell phones all fairly, look the same, especially with the smartphones. And we know that they can pretty much do the same thing as each other. If I go on a computer, I can access the internet, I can edit a video. It really doesn't matter what type of computer I'm on, right? So within those shells, there is an operating system that makes it go. That's like the brain of the computer or the brain of the phone, the operating system. And so if we look at all the computers in the world or all the phones in the world, that is what would fall under the neurodiversity umbrella, right? Because brain, neuro, diversity, difference. Everybody's brain is a little bit different. So neurodiversity encompasses the whole world. So we are all part of neurodiversity, everybody on this call right now. Now, if you look at the PC people or the we'll be same side here. We'll say PC or Android, okay? Then we know that those operating systems work the same way. So if I have an Android phone and you have an Android phone, we can accomplish tasks the same way. And so let's say that those are the majority. The PC and the Android are the majority of people in the world. That's what we would call neurotypical generally. So the majority of the people whose brains work approximately the same way to accomplish those outputs. And with Katie's stat that she shared, I believe that is 77%, right? That's 77%. That's the neurotypical percent. Then we've got this other group of people, right? The Macs and the iPhones. And they, again, can put out the same type of output, the videos, the accessing the internet, but the way that they do it is very different. If you've ever tried to go from an Android to an iPhone or from a PC to a Mac and try to operate the same way, it doesn't quite work because their operating system is very, very different. And that would be what we would call the neurodivergent population, people whose brains work similarly in a lot of ways to each other, but different from the majority. And that is kind of a way that we can understand what the neurodiversity picture is. And if you go to slide 15, please. One thing that characterizes neurodivergent individuals is that we tend to have really high levels of skill in certain areas. So if you think of some of the stereotypes, right, you think of, oh, an autistic person who can do math just at the drop of the hat, or maybe able to play lots of musical instruments. Those would be examples of what we call high spike talents. Just if you think of kind of the curve, they're way off the chart in terms of what they can do. But for every high spike talent generally that a neurodivergent person has, there also is a corresponding challenge or weakness that would be beyond what you would expect, where it doesn't quite make sense. If somebody can operate at such a high level in one area, then how could they have such difficulty? If you think of the nutty professor, right, or the absent-minded professor, you had somebody who was a genius, but who couldn't do the things that you needed to do to just get out the door in the morning. And that is what can happen with neurodivergent individuals. I tend to be very verbal. I was reading when I was, started reading when I was 3 and was fully reading when I was 4, especially things that were too old for me. Those have always been my favorite type of reading material. But what I absolutely lack is I have a lot of trouble with memory. I have a lot of trouble with processing speed. My favorite common response to any stimulus, anytime somebody says something to me, I usually respond with what first, because it just takes me a while to get my brain going to process. And what's different about high spike individuals is that in corporate America, we're much more used to the dark line you see in the middle there, where people's strengths and weaknesses are really close together. So you think, oh, if somebody was hired in for a customer service role, then they can probably learn to take on a sales ops role. Or they, if somebody's an instructional designer, then they could probably take the leap and become a graphic designer as well. But it can be hard then when you have a workplace that's designed for these people whose skills are kind of in the middle, when you've got this population coming in the door that have these vast differences between strengths and weaknesses. Katie, is there anything you wanted to add there?
No, I think you're spot on, right? Because, and I think it resonates definitely in the workplace, and it's a, when we look at HR departments, managers, directors, your coworkers, I think that's the point here, right? Is to have patience with how, someone might think. There might be spikes, there might be flat lines. We all have to coexist. So I think that's perfect.
Absolutely. So if you go to slide 16, what we would love, and I think the goal for both Katie and I, is that that tree that we looked at that had those different neurotypes on it, we would love if really the way we started to think about that was more like what's on the screen now. Because these are examples of some of the many, many, many skills that neurodivergent individuals can bring into the workforce. And I don't know about you, but I would be thrilled to have any of these skills in my business. So the challenge becomes then, how do we support and accommodate people who operate outside of the model that we already have built in the corporate environment? So if you go to the next slide. Some of the things that people experience at work that are challenging when they are neurodivergent, again, thinking and processing speed, I am not the only one for sure, but you can have challenges with colleagues when there are miscommunications or people aren't reading the social situation the same way, or they're not following the same unspoken rules that everybody knows, except for us, it seems like. You can also, since you're taking in more information, you can be more sensitive, because anything like the lights in the office for somebody who is neurodivergent could be 10 times brighter than they appear for somebody who is neurotypical. So you might be very sensitive to things that other people don't anticipate. You can also have trouble with focus and attention, and just overall, the way that we communicate often tends to be very literal and direct, which in a culture that is focused on friendliness and emotional intelligence sometimes can be read as rude or condescending, when really we're just talking the way we talk. We're just saying things the way that they are. And so those are an example of some of the challenges we have to think about overcoming, because these things all together mean that your neurodivergent colleagues who are doing their very best to fit in are also likely experiencing exhaustion and burnout, additional mental health challenges, additional physical ailments that all come from just trying to fit in with everybody else. So if you go to slide,
And,
go ahead.
sorry, and Melissa, sorry, Jessica, when we get through, looking at all of that, it's also important to understand the work output, right? So in a workplace, oftentimes you do have um, you have performance reviews and you have things like that, right? And you have projects that are due. So looking at like output of what these great brains can bring to the table is also, I think, incredibly important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We tend to have a culture that says, okay, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? Well, let's shore up your weaknesses so they're as good as your strengths. Now, we tend to be in work culture now leaning a little bit more towards strengths-based leadership, where we really want people to lean into their strengths. But what we don't tend to do is work on eliminating or mitigating a lot of those parts of the job that do tend to drive into your weaknesses. It's sort of like, suck it up there and go ahead then, and you can do the things that relate more to your strengths. But for a lot of people, those characteristics, those are not moldable. Those are not fixable. One, because there's nothing wrong with having a brain that's different, But two, those are part of the way somebody's brain works, and you cannot change them on a whim. And so even as we're leaning more towards strengths, that is not quite enough to get us where we need to be in terms of inclusion. And if you go to slide 23, Eric, that'd be great. So when we talk about neuro inclusion, what we're really going after is creating an environment where everybody, all employees, are able to be supported and accommodated in order to be their best self when they are at work. And that is one of the misconceptions that we really want to make sure we dispel with people. We're not talking about creating a totally different setup and system and set of performance expectations for everybody who comes in the door. What we're talking about is making sure that the things that are able to be flexible flex in order to help people, because regardless of why we have preferences, we all know that there are things that can happen in the workplace that make things better or worse for us. For example, I tend to really crash about 4 o'clock. That is as far as my brain and my ability to interact with humans will take me, and then I have to take a nap. A lot of times I'll jump back on later, or I might be done for the day, but I really can't take any meetings after 4. So that's my reason for not being able to work past 4. But I have a team member who needs to go pick up his kids. He's got kids, they are in daycare, and he needs to leave by 4 in order to get there in time to pick up his kids. And then I have another coworker who's getting her master's degree, and she has a class in the evening, and she has to leave by 4 in order to make it to her class on time. So when we look at being supported and accommodated, all three of us need the same thing. We all want to work in a workplace that allows us to leave by 4, but our reasoning is totally different. And so when we talk about supporting all employees, that's really what we're looking at, is how can we make the workplace work better for everybody, not just one set of people or another. Anything, I know that you're really passionate about neuro inclusion. Katie, is there anything you'd like to add here as we have this part of our discussion?
Yeah, no, I think you're on the right track. And the only thing I would add is, it's acceptance, right? So as a manager, director, HR, coworker, it's accepting that we're all, just we're all thinking differently. We all might have different challenges, but Jessica, you definitely hit it on the head. So perfect.
Thank you. Thank you. So we can have all sorts of different preferences, right? When we talk about things like meeting times, which could be even for a global audience, we talk about making physical adjustments to a workspace like the light. We talk about how we communicate. Are we email people? Are we Slack people? Are we pick up the phone people? But then we also, of course, for our group today, we have different preferences in the way that we learn. And I'm not hitting on, don't worry, I'm not hitting on the theory, the debunked theory of learning styles. But what I am saying is that there are people who, when they get an e-learning, the first thing they do is try to hit that next button as many times as possible to see if they can get to the end without watching it. There are people, if it's a video, they hit play and they go do something else because they're going to try to learn from the process document, maybe that's included. There are some people who a live setting is fantastic, but when they're in the live setting, they're not going to look the way that engaged learners typically look. Right. So there are lots of things when it comes to corporate learning that are directly related to these preferences. And that's our focus for today. So if you want to go to slide 36, Eric. So one of the things that yeah, that's great. One of the things that in L&D that we really need to think about is, how are the design elements that we are including, how do they affect our audience. Because sometimes we make decisions that aren't necessarily thought out from the perspective of what could this do to somebody who has a particular sensitivity. So if you go to slide 37. So some design elements that we really want to be aware of when it comes to neuroinclusion: background music. And this could be background music in an e-learning. It could be in a webinar when people are getting logged in. Music can be awesome, but for some people, it can be extremely distracting. So if you are asking people questions while you have background music, then that can be a real challenge for some of the learners. Sometimes when I go into a webinar or a VILT, you have background music going and the facilitator will say, hey, introduce yourself in chat and we've got a question for you to answer about our topic. Well, I've got this music going on and I'm being given instruction, and that's too much. I could do one or the other and not both. So background music is something that you want to be very thoughtful about when it comes to your e-learning. And sometimes with stakeholders, they say, oh, but it sounds so pretty. Well, as being learning experts, sometimes we do need to educate people in that background music could actually be causing people to learn less than if it was not included or if it was optional in your e-learning. Things like captions are critically important. And this should be something that is able to be toggled on or off by the learner, because while a lot of people really love captions, and that's not just neurodivergent people, that can be people who have a hearing difficulty, that just can be people who need to focus a little bit more, and some people just like them. Those captions need to be able to be toggled on and off because for some people, they're super distracting. We know adult learning studies tell us it's very difficult for people to read what's on the screen and listen at the same time. So if you're one of those people, then captions are not going to be great. So that's an excellent element to add with that caveat. We want to think about things like visuals and animation. I know some of the most fun e-learnings I've ever taken have been things where there's an astronaut theme or where you're putting together a puzzle that makes a teapot that pours a cup of tea, and they're so cool. But for some individuals, those animations, especially if they're flashing, can be very difficult. They can be distracting to the point of not allowing learners to learn. So one of the things that we often, when we get into this space, that we kind of fall victim to is they say, I want to make the perfect learning. I want my in-person learning to be perfect for everybody. I want my e-learning to be absolutely perfect for every single learner. So I'm going to make it something that is adapted for everyone. Unfortunately, you really can't make the thing that is going to be perfect for everybody who interacts with it. So when we think of something like visuals or animations, we want to be thoughtful about when we include them or not, because sometimes an animation is the best way to train, right? If we think of, say, a manufacturing environment where you're trying to show people how to put things together, then just a static visual with a voiceover, that is not the best way to do that. So in that case, animation is likely going to be your way to go. So we're not trying to say, hey, make this perfect for everybody. We're trying to say, be thoughtful about what you include and just know how it may or may not affect certain learners within your population. Maybe if you're going to put the animations in, then really, really, really be careful with things like background music or other elements of your e-learning that are also likely to be challenging for a similar group of people. Competition, opt-in. So gamification, we know, has been one of the buzzwords over the last few years, and that's awesome. But there are people for whom just the idea of competition is something that inhibits them from being able to learn. And so when we think of something like gamification, we assume everybody loves a competition. That's not true. So if it is not a required element of what you're doing, can you allow people to opt out of that competition piece? Or even better, make the competition opt in and see what percentage of your learners engage with your content in that way. There are certain things that are just standard accessibility. So fonts, we want to make sure we use sans serif fonts like we see on the slide here, as opposed to the T we see in the right-hand corner of the slide, no little extra tails on letters. Those are harder to read. Those are also harder for screen readers to read as well, for people who use those for accessibility. And for your input options, any e-learning or any VILT, anything that you're doing where you're asking learners to engage via their computer, they should be able to engage with that using their mouse and their keyboard for accessibility, and again, to make sure those screen readers are able to interact with that content in a way that you know that your learner is getting what you intended. So if you could go to slide 39, please. Another element that we really want to think hard about is activities. So if we think of a live session and we think of table activities, we want to think about, sometimes when we have like the four corners type of activity where people are going to various areas of the room and maybe doing different things at different stations. Switching between tasks can be really challenging for certain learners. So is that something that you're doing for fun? Or is it something that you're doing because it really stimulates learning? Again, we're not saying don't ever do this, but we are saying maybe don't hold it against your participants when they need a little extra time to go through that set of instructions at the second station. Maybe block that extra time in for people so that they are free to learn in the way that makes the most sense for their brain. We also want to be careful of sensory things like smells in the room. Lunch should be out in the hallway and not in the room itself, because the smells of certain things, if you're super sensitive, can be really challenging. The lights, and then sound is big. My spouse can hear electricity. When something is plugged in, she can hear it. And she can hear, for example, if cell phones are charged, when they hit 100%. So if she's in a room where there's a clinking light, nothing is going to happen in terms of learning that day. So what can we do in terms of the sensory environment to make things that are better for people? We also want to think about breakout rooms and participation activities. Is that something that is truly required for the learning? And is there an alternative method that people could learn from in that environment? So things like multimodal learning can be really great. If somebody doesn't want to participate in a live room where they might do a breakout, could they watch a video? Could they do an e-learning or read from a process document and get the same information? Because not everybody functions perfectly in one setting. We tend to think live is better, but it isn't for everybody. So what can we do to be more inclusive? So that's really what we're challenging folks to do here. And Eric, I know you said you wanted to get to questions by this time. So if we want to move into some questions, or we have some more L&D things we can talk about.
Sure. Yeah, I think we'll just go into Q&A. If anybody has questions, please go into the chat. I will read them out loud. There is one question to start, and it's, can you talk more about the learning styles being debunked?
Yes, and just to say that that is an older methodology, where we have the bodily kinesthetic learners and the auditory. Generally, those have been that learning model, that theory has over the years found to be inaccurate. And so I would encourage you to take an ATD class. ATD instructional design courses address this really beautifully, whether it's like the more intensive course or even just the one dayer. I highly recommend those. Or if you Google it, you will be able to take a look. But I would just look at ATD. They've got the best resources, I think, for learning professionals.
Wonderful. There, anybody have any other questions? Please put them in chat. Yeah.
Yeah, Katie, while we're waiting for the next question to come in, what are some things that you would like, when you think of how neurodivergent people learn, especially in a corporate space or in a workspace? I know with your experience, we work in slightly different environments. What are some things that you've seen either work really well or not work as well with employees?
Sure. So I think it's education and awareness, right? So it's sometimes a manager, a director, your coworker, they may have no idea what these um, intricacies could be. And so I think it's that education and awareness piece that is most important, especially as you look at managers, directors, because really in the corporate work environment, as much as we want to coexist, businesses are around to make money, right? And so there is this concept of performance reviews and things like that. But then how do you marry that with kind of this concept of, coexisting, being patient, letting people, do work on their own time? So that's really interesting to me because I think it's a push and pull. And I would love your feedback on that as well.
Yeah, oh boy. And if you are interested in learning about performance management, please contact SkillSource because we've got a whole course on performance management for a neuro-inclusive business. So neuro-inclusive performance management is a big topic. A lot of it comes from checking our assumptions about the way people look and sound and assigning behaviors to that. We say, oh, this person isn't engaged because they don't smile, they aren't throwing their hand up in the air, and they seem withdrawn. Well, those are judgments that we're placing on an individual based upon our previous experiences. But I know when I'm listening, when I'm really focusing, I look the least engaged that you can possibly look. I'm turned around in my chair. I've got a fidget thing going on because I need a way to divert that extra energy in my brain so that I can really focus. So if you're a manager and you are looking at an employee, or you're an educator and you're looking at a learner and they look totally the way you would expect somebody who is just not professional to look, you really
Correct.
need to check that instinct and engage with that person, because there is a chance that everything that you're reading incorrectly. And you know what? We get it. Like we've all operated with the best information that we can up until this point. If you didn't know, you didn't know. But what we would encourage you to do now that you do know is to make sure before you make that judgment about somebody, especially when it comes to performance, like, hey, you didn't execute this the way I asked you to. It must be because you don't know what you're doing or you don't care. Or it's because they needed more explicit instructions and you didn't provide that for them. And given that, they're able to do amazing work. So instead of making kind of traditional assumptions about performance, we really want to make sure we're judging performance itself and not personality. And that, I think, applies directly to learning too. So that's a huge, huge topic. But SkillSource can help you out with some great resources. Or Katie and I are happy to work with individuals or businesses to make sure that you've got a neuro-inclusive space when it comes to learning or performance. Absolutely.
Another question came in. Can you talk at all about how to create a more inclusive interviewing experience for applicants?
Do you want to take this one, Katie, or should I?
Yeah, go for it, please,
So
Jessica.
yeah, so the biggest thing is the recruiting system right now is not set up for neurodivergent people. That's one of the biggest barriers. When Katie shared that alarming statistic about 80% of people that are neurodivergent being underemployed, a lot of that has to do with the interview process. And that's because the recruiting process tests a lot of abilities, but none of them have to do with things that you would do on the job. Right? Filling out a resume and then, or providing a resume and then accurately filling out a 10-page application with no typos, that is not an activity you're going to be doing on the job. Answering questions in an interview and knowing the rules about, oh, you don't ask about money until this interview, or you answer these questions in this particular way. Those expectations test somebody's ability to interview and to research and maybe have the resources to be able to be trained in interviewing. They don't necessarily have any correlation with the things that people do on the job. So when we say things like provide interview questions in advance, people get aghast and they say, oh, that's cheating. It isn't really, because answering those questions is likely not going to be part of what happens on the job. And the interview should be about how is this person going to be able to do the work, not interview. And there's so much, we do a whole course on this, and we're happy to we're happy to do that. But the other thing I would say is there's a myth of a culture fit. A culture fit is how many people that are exactly like me can I bring in? Because neurodivergent people, for example, lose out when you say culture fit, because you may say, oh, we have a very outgoing environment. Our team likes to really tease each other and we're very sarcastic. So this person, we shouldn't hire them because they wouldn't fit into that environment. Well, that's discriminatory, because what you are judging as culture fit is really the way someone's brain works. And so be very careful of the culture fit.
Yeah, and Jessica, I would just add in one quick comment, and I know we're running short on time, but I would say also, I think there could also be a disconnect, right? Oftentimes HR, and this may get into a political thing, but sometimes HR says, okay, well, we want to hire more neurodivergents. Great, wonderful, that's perfect. But oftentimes the baton that's passed to the manager or director, they're not really equipped with the right skills. And I think SkillSource can definitely help with that as well, because I think that transition period of getting hired, okay, you get hired, check the box off, and then actually day-to-day working, which is what you're kind of alluding to, Jessica, is also like so.
Yeah, I would say the advice from both of us is probably don't start with a recruiting program. If you don't have any internal supports or any internal mechanism for supporting neurodivergent employees, then hiring them in the door is doing them a disservice also, because they're going to get through the supportive interview process and then be unsupported in the part that matters, which is their work. And then you've not done anything good for them, other than something maybe that you want to post up on your website that you've got this great recruiting program. But that's not where we need the most help. So do a recruiting program for sure, but put that after you've got your support mechanisms in place internally.
Well said.
Wonderful. Well, this concludes Roundtable 2. Thank you, everybody, for showing up, and special thank you to Katie and Jessica. This has been extremely informative. To everybody that is listening, please be on the lookout on LinkedIn. I will be posting the link to this whole roundtable, and be on the lookout for the next one. That'll be in October. It'll be around customer success. Thank you again, everybody, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Jessica. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.